Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Todd did a great job keying up the sort of framework for the discussion we're going to have today. And we only have an hour. We have brought together really the preeminent minds on the issue. We're going to start, I think it's not by, or it's certainly by design that we're starting with reliability. It really is the foundation upon which any market design or approach needs to focus. That's our objective. I think it's a great way to kick off the discussion before we get into some of the other elements, innovation, et cetera. So we have brought together the, by the way, I am Nancy Bagot, Senior Vice President at EPSA. In May, I will have been there 20 years. So even I am shocked by that. In terms of reliability, the conversation seems to have shifted a bit in terms of we have some real emerging focuses. The extreme weather, the sort of devastating Storm Uri in Texas from last winter. We've had summer resource issues and concerns in California and the West and other areas recently. And one of the things we're going to talk about is how and whether that changes the discussion, changes approaches, and how each, from every different sector of the industry, we're thinking about it and dealing with it. So we have brought together, as I said, I think really the preeminent. We've gone to the top for you. We have Jim Robb, who is the head of NERC and spends all of his time thinking about reliability nationally and regionally, of course. We have Manu Asthana, who is the CEO and president of PJM. So he is going to be able to talk from market operator standpoint, dealing with the market design, which ensures reliability and serving 13 states, including the District of Columbia. And we have Thad Hill, and he can give us a perspective as CEO and president of Calpine, as a private investor and developer and operator of the resources that ensure reliability, the market mechanisms, and the requirements that signal the types of investment that his company make, both in new resources, but also operations and maintenance of existing resources. And then we have a preeminent economist, Devin Hartman, who is the resident senior fellow and policy director of energy and environment at R Street Institute. He also was at Elcon for a time, and so I know was involved with NERC at the end use. So he has experience from that, as well as looking really deeply into the different types of market designs, how they impact reliability, ensure reliability objectives are met. So we will get started, and I thought the best place to start would be with Jim Robb, who can sort of address the foundational discussion here, ensuring reliability, and also, sort of whether and how the transition we've seen in the energy resource mix in order to attain clean energy goals, how that's impacting reliability in either minor or major ways, and also the changing landscape of weather events in terms of their extremity and duration. So that's the question I'm going to pose to you, Jim.
So how much time do we have?
Have things really changed? I know. Have things really changed much, or are we on course?
Oh, yeah, no, it's the last 2 years brought, I think, extraordinary clarity, right, to the risks that we have embedded in the system, driven by kind of changing climate dynamics. These weather systems that we call them kind of longer, deeper, broader, longer in duration, big issue if you're working off of inventoried fuels. Deeper, right, more extreme temperatures, whether either hotter than anticipated or colder than anticipated, and what more importantly from a utility perspective is broader in terms of the breadth of the country that's impacted. So you think about these heat domes that we've had in the West, the Winter Storm Uri is a great example, and that's a real problem because utilities can't rely as much on transfers to bail them out when they're affected, because everybody's affected. We did a little look through our Situational Awareness database during Winter Storm Uri. We could have found the generation that would have kind of preserved ERCOT's ability to serve load, but we'd be wheeling it from peninsular Florida. And Montana
Yeah.
and places like that, right? And the cost to build that transmission is ungodly. So it's a very, very different world. I think the second thing we've got to realize is that these weather systems are also impacting the generation fleet's ability to perform, basically because of fuel, right? We have our fuel supply is increasingly dependent on weather. That's clearly true in the case of wind and solar, but also true of natural gas, right? Particularly during cold events. The gas won't show up because it'll be preserved to serve LDC load in every jurisdiction that I know of. So that becomes a real issue as well. And then the third compounding factor is that our demand for reliability is high and will only go up as we push to electrify more and more parts of the economy. Our tolerance for even momentary outages or any sort of disruption is going to go to zero very, very quickly. So at a time where we're putting much more, I shouldn't say necessarily more risk, but different risks out on the system than what we've dealt with. So what does that all mean from a reliability perspective? One is we really need much, much better situation awareness between the system operators, the generators, and importantly, the fuel suppliers. Because that's been the one common link I've seen in our assessments of kind of major reliability events driven by weather. That was true in 2011. It was true in the 2018 cold weather event, and was certainly true in Winter Storm Uri. Right, the system operator and the generators just didn't know how whether their fuel was going to show up, what their plant could perform to, and so the operators are scrambling, trying to make decisions in real time that they should have had the ability to plan for. So finding some mechanism to get much better situation awareness across the system is a really important deal. I think the second thing that we have to come to grips with is that the way we've thought about reliability and resource adequacy absolutely needs to change. Right? We've spent all of our time, all of us in this room grew up in a world where you look to see how much, what your peak load was going to be, make sure you had enough capacity to serve that plus a margin, and then you figured you could serve every other hour of the year. Sure. You can't do that anymore because the energy supply is no longer, the fuel supply is no longer guaranteed to be there. So we really need to kind of change our mindset away from capacity and a reserve margin equaling reliability to the ability to really assess, can we perform, can we deliver energy to customers as demanded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And that requires a very different mindset and different planning paradigm. So those are the two things that jump out at me, right? The way we plan and operate the system, and then the need for new situation awareness for these extreme weather events, which frankly may be extreme, but they're not uncommon and becoming more routine. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Manu, so these are some of the challenges you are facing. Oh, sorry, got it. And you are, CEO and president of a region that covers so many states that I'm sure that you are dealing with different geographical issues. You've got different state tensions. In terms of state, they've got some authority over their resource adequacy approaches. So as the system operator for such a wide part of the country, are you changing your approach to some of these issues that are impacting reliability? And are market mechanisms helping getting you there, or is this mostly a focus operationally on some of the planning parameters, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Nancy, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see people in person. It's like being at a buffet where you want to consume all the food at once. But it's really wonderful to be here with you. And great to be here with EPSA. I've really followed EPSA. We have a lot of people that lobby us. And EPSA, I think, is one of the best, which doesn't mean I always agree with EPSA, but I always find your input to be extremely thoughtful. So thank you for having me here and for really thoughtful input. I agree with everything Jim said. The only thing I'd say is, during Uri, we at PJM had record exports, and maybe we could have helped out a little bit more too if there was more transmission. Although we were pushing over 15,000 megawatts of power at one point to our neighboring systems, and that was being wheeled all the way through to SPP. So Jim, you talked a lot about extreme weather. and the importance of situational awareness and coordination across the industry and across the fuel suppliers, which I completely agree with. The other thing I will throw into the mix is this dual, almost existential crisis that our policymakers are grappling with today in the US and globally. And on one hand, you have climate change, and I absolutely believe climate change is real and it is affecting our industry, and we need to plan for it, and we need to try to limit, this is my personal view, the harm from climate change to something that we can live with as a species. On the other hand, you've got security of supply, you've got fuel security, which has been made much worse by the Russia-Ukraine crisis. You've got affordability. And as Jim said, ERCOT was a really sobering reminder that modern society has no tolerance for extended power outages. And we're in this period of a lot of transition, a lot of churn, and it's being driven by policymakers, it's being driven by consumers, as Todd said in his opening address, it's being driven by technology changes. Right? And we're not a policymaker, so we see our role as trying to enable reliability and affordability through this transition, but to help and to facilitate the achievement of our policymakers' objectives. That's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of transition all at once, and it's a lot to ask of one market, right? One set of markets. We've got one capacity market, one energy market, one set of ancillary services market. So how is one set of markets going to achieve all of those objectives for all of those different policymakers when the objectives aren't, they seem to be directionally the same and grappling with the same two overarching themes, but they're not the same. We have 13 jurisdictions and the District of Columbia, and all of their objectives are somewhat different. And so I think it's tempting to say, let's go back to a lack of markets. Let's go back to just central planning. And I think that would be a huge mistake. I think that markets, PJM's markets alone, but markets of our neighboring systems across the country and across the world have already demonstrated that they can facilitate a significant transition. If you think back to that chart that Todd threw up around PJM emissions going down 39% since the market opened, 33% in the last 15 years, that transition was facilitated by markets, by competition. And I strongly believe that markets will be the best way to facilitate the coming transition. And the answer to what will the design of those markets need to be is not straightforward. We have done some modeling. We haven't publicly released it yet. I did talk about it at CERAWeek. That looks at, under certain assumptions, what would our ramps look like if we have 70% of the energy in PJM from carbon-free sources over the year, right? So that's about 50% renewables, 20% nuclear. In a simulation of ramps, the worst ramp that we see, the worst, or the most aggressive ramp that we see is about 22,000, 23,000 megawatt hours an hour. And from low to high, right, it's about a little over 70,000 megawatts in a day. And so if you think about that, that's an ISO New England per hour for a low to high of ERCOT. That's what we have to prepare for. And that's what this transition could lead us towards. And so how do we bring that about with markets? I think our current markets will have to evolve. And there's a lot of work going on. We can talk about that later if you'd like, to help those markets evolve. And I know there's a lot of financial interests. I know that EPSA members have a set of interests. I know that there are other interests. And we have to sort of balance all of those and make our markets successful so we can help our policymakers achieve their dual objectives of reliability, fuel security, as well as decarbonization. But I firmly believe that markets are the most efficient way, or put another way, they're the worst way except for all the others. So let me leave it there.
Thank you. Well, I think you have well explained why there are so many PJM stakeholder meetings. So thank you for that.
Sorry about that. All right.
And I think you have perfectly opened the door to Thad, who can talk about sort of the role of the market mechanisms that are in place, the price signals, how that incentivizes you as an investor in the resources and technologies to deliver power as reliably as possible, particularly as sort of some of the factors are shifting.
Yes, and thanks, Nancy. And it's great to be here. I've known all my fellow panelists and worked with them over years in different ways, so it's great to be here.
It is great to be
and
here.
with all of you. So I'm going to take a step back just for a second and talk about, and Todd did a little bit of this, but the numbers are staggering of what markets have produced. And I'll come around to what I think the critical component is in a minute. But over the last 10 years, there have been about 45,000 new megawatts of generation built in PJM, and another 10,000 megawatts or so of demand response energy efficiency. And that's in a market that's flat. Now, there's been a lot of retirements too. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? In New England, there have been several thousand megawatts of new generation in a market that's declining. Again, a healthy revitalization. In ERCOT, over the last decade, the number is in the mid-30,000s of new resources. 20%-ish is gas, but a lot of it's renewable. And in fact, if you take the last few years plus the next few years, if you kind of look over a 12-year period, we're going to have 20,000 new megawatts of wind, almost 20,000 megawatts of solar, and almost 2,000 megawatts of storage. I mean, that's not somebody deciding that you need a long-term contract. That is the market actually producing the investment. And whether it's an energy market or whether it's a capacity market, these investments have been produced. Over the same time period, by the way, as Todd mentioned, emissions have fallen. And I think it's really important to keep in mind, and I'm going to use New Jersey as an example, that you could do it for almost every state. In New Jersey, the average customer bill in 2020 was about the same as in 2011. But the difference is the wholesale power generation cost was down by 40%, but the regulated cost, the non-bypassable charges, were up by 60%. Now, other than that means I should have been a utility guy, it'd be an easier way to make a living. The second thing that I'll actually take on that is that competition works. It actually lowers bills, and it produces investment. And so we want this. Now, why does that work? Because all the capital is being invested by people that are spending risk capital, not by guaranteed returns. It's on the customer, not the ratepayer. And the great examples I can pick of when ratepayers make the decisions, you end up with things like Vogel, Sumner, and Kemper. For any of you who followed the industry, that is funny. I didn't get a laugh, I thought, of this audience. But yeah, thank you. But that's kind of where you go. So what does it take to make a market work? And we're going to talk about all kinds of changes. And I agree with Manu that the markets are going to have to evolve to the new reality, and they're absolutely going to have to evolve. And we'll talk about all that. But what is bedrock is that the investors actually believe they have a fair shot to turn their return on and return of capital over time. And if you can establish an environment, what the new rules over time may have to be, where investors get comfortable that you can get a return of and a return on capital, the capital will absolutely flow. And so as we go through this conversation, and we'll talk about a lot of things, I think the question should be, what can we do in the new market designs where investors know they have the return of and return on capital? Because if investors are not comfortable with that, and we've seen this play out in California, where there hasn't been a new megawatt built in 20 years without a state contract or a state-approved contract. Central planning all over again. I don't think we want that. We have got to come up with mechanisms that allow that confidence, and the risk capital will flow. And so, anyway, I'm sure we'll get into a lot more details.
Yeah, sure we will. And you have opened the door to issues that I know Devin has spent quite a bit of time on, is looking at the different models and how they have been successful or not, particularly in terms of achieving reliable service, but sort of remaining affordable for consumers. So Devin, can you talk about some of the work that you've done, sort of the research you've done into the different competitive models and pluses and minuses, I'm assuming.
Absolutely, happy to dig right in. So I think Todd and Manu did a nice job talking about how we're in an era of completely different economic characteristics in the industry and a completely different set of stakeholder preferences, including state and federal officials, but also, the consumer preferences and the capital markets that Thad referenced. There's so much more than where we were at even a decade ago when we were predominantly talking about, how do you just plan for your summer peak? Let's just do cost minimization. And we'll do that. Everything else will be procured as a byproduct. Started to have some environmental interest trickling in at different degrees then. We're in a completely different era. And going forward, what we're seeing is that on the supply side of the equation, there's way more complexity, way more diversity of available generation resources. On the demand side, you're seeing consumer preferences really balloon, right? And of course, I have a little bit more history with the large consumers, and seeing especially how the ESG movement has completely transformed their appetite for having more autonomy and mechanisms of autonomy is incredible. But then even down to the small consumer level, the same basics of cost and reliability still apply. But what we're also seeing, even with, say, millennials who by and large don't have a lot of capital to work with yet, you're still seeing a ton of environmental preferences infused at that level. So the question is, how do we orient our institutions and our policies to maximize all of these objectives, recognizing that there's some trade-offs involved? Right now, what we've clearly seen is that, at least on the RTO question going forward, there really is no question on the merits. It's really kind of a silly conversation that we're still even having this debate. RTOs, whether they're market participants are IPPs or even cost of service, you're still seeing very clear cost and reliability advantages, and you're also seeing emissions trajectories decline. That's both because you're seeing better innovation and cheaper compliance pathways with environmental policies, but you're also seeing the natural organic market development that's driving deep emissions cuts. Keep in mind going forward, that the predominant driver of clean energy investments and clean appetite is not actually coming from state mandates anymore. It's predominantly voluntary private capital. By some estimates, 60 to 80%. That has a very profound implication for this, and this is why a lot of leaders in this space are pushing for RTOs across the country. Now, this brings me to the next point of, in an RTO, I think you see a very big performance gap between the merchants and the integrated utilities in this space. And this may be something I can dig into in further depth in a little bit. But I think that's starting to really play out in many ways. Everything from questions on why was the coal self-scheduling problem that got so many headlines a couple years ago limited to just cost of service entities, whereas the merchants were actually responding to price signals. In some of the footprints like SPP and MISO, for example, there's a big problem and major questions on market design where you have mostly generators don't respond to price signals very well because they're just passing through revenues and costs to captive customers. That's a real problem. Whereas if you look at some of the Eastern RTOs in ERCOT, you see actually these generators being very responsive and anticipatory. You're also seeing the demand side of the equation, and flexible demand is a huge part of meeting our reliability conditions going forward, especially with renewables integration. You're seeing marketplaces unlock opportunities for flexible demand. So on the whole, we really need to have RTOs as an institution better appreciated. That debate is over, and really the question on the best model for procurement and ownership of these assets is unquestionably competitive at this juncture.
Great, thank you so much. So, Jim, you talked about a shift in the way we need to look at what's required to ensure reliability. So it's really sort of a change to looking at energy availability rather than capacity. Do you see, is this something that varies by region? Do you see do you think that shift will require sort of major reforms to market approaches or the capacity and energy market designs that are sort of at play in different regions of the country?
Well, first of all, I think you're clearly seeing these stresses play out differently regionally, right? So I always talk about California, Texas, and New England as being kind of the three hot spots for how the world is evolving. But I would also say that these are previews of coming attractions, right? So these will be coming to a theater near you soon. It may take a while, but but the dynamics are clearly there. And I love the planning reference that Manu made around looking at the ramping requirements that they would have under a certain generation portfolio to achieve policy objectives. And everybody ought to be doing that kind of planning because the stresses that those ramp rates will create both on the generation fleet, but don't forget what's happening to the gas system underneath that, because most of those plants are likely to be gas-fired. And when we took a look at the situation in California with Aliso Canyon, when it was taken out of service, we really discovered the value of gas storage, right? Because it was the kind of the shock absorber in the system that maintained pressure in the LDC while the power plants were sucking out gas much faster than El Paso and Transwestern could pack it in. So it's a very integrated problem across the sector. And I think the million-dollar question that the industry ecosystem needs to figure out in this transition is in a world where policymakers don't like gas, right? Gas has become the new coal in many areas. What do we think is going to provide that balancing capability? It could be hydrogen, but boy, that's a long, long way away. Yeah. It could be batteries, but we don't have a battery technology that can perform cost effectively at the scale we would need it to with the durations that we would need. Could be small nuclear reactors, right, with flexible characteristics, but that's a long, long way off. And so here's the thing that terrifies me in this transition is a lot of people believe that gas and gas generation is a bridge fuel, and I'll stipulate to that. I think a lot of people think that that bridge is about this long, and I think most people in this room would say this bridge extends from that wall to that wall. But your point of view on the length of that bridge dictates an awful lot as to what you do in terms of investing in infrastructure. And the other point that I would make that I think is very, very important for this group and for policymakers to understand is that the inability to invest in infrastructure, whether that's gas infrastructure or transmission, is really going to cripple our ability to meet any of the emission reduction targets that we have. Because we're going to need more of that infrastructure to enable the continued investment in low carbon generation. So.
Right. So Manu, how does Jim's million-dollar question perhaps impact your understanding of the priorities? So you have a lot of meetings at PJM, but it's because you really are looking at a lot of market reforms and mechanisms that can be improved or shifted in some way. Could you prioritize a few things that you think are really, perhaps in a shorter term, critical to addressing the sort of reliability pressures that we are facing?
Yeah, Nancy, thanks. That's a big question. So let me try to chunk it down. One of the premises of the question he asked Jim was, so is it only about energy markets and our capacity markets going away? And I wanted to address that because I think that is a priority. If you look at Jim's bridge analogy, which I love, I think it is a long bridge. And in fact, PJM is on the record as saying that we think we need access to our thermal generation until and unless there's a replacement set of assets in place. And so we think from a policy perspective, our recommendation is to maintain access to that flexible ramping generation for as long as it is needed. And that should be demonstrated by something else is in place, then it's not needed anymore. And that is a reality. I think as a society, we're heading to that place, but that is, the size of the bridge is unknown at this point. But think about what that world looks like. It's a world where there's a lot of zero variable cost or negative variable cost based on tax policy generation. And so energy prices, other things being equal, are lower. Right? It's a world where our thermal generation, even if we're keeping it, isn't running as much. And so how do you actually incentivize those generators to be available and ready to run when you need them? How do you incentivize the gas industry to actually provide that increased amount of gas flexibility for those generators when you need them, which is rarely, but when we need them, we need them. That's what the world, I think, is going to look like. And so I think actually that makes the capacity market continually important, perhaps increasingly important for some reasons. And maybe there's there's an answer in the form of other ancillary services that we procure for ramping or some other form of flexibility. But I think we really need to think hard about resource adequacy, but then upstream of that is the question of revenue adequacy for all forms of generation, right? Because we're trying to incentivize and facilitate this transition, so the markets need to do that. They can't be a barrier to that. They need to be an enabler to that, but they need to incentivize reliability through the transition. And so, I think one priority for us that we're tackling through our Resource Adequacy Senior Task Force is how do our markets, particularly our capacity markets, need to evolve, both in structure, but also in terms of what it is that they're procuring. Are you procuring for a 1 in 10 year LOLE, or are you trying to actually procure for some estimated unserved energy that you're minimizing, or some other metric? What are the qualifications of the generators that can participate in that market? How do you accredit capacity is another very hot question. So those are really, the work of that Resource Adequacy Senior Task Force to think about the next evolution of our capacity market, I think is very high priority, as is the work of our Interconnection Process Reform Senior Task Force to think about how do we actually get all of this generation. And we have 225,000 plus megawatts in our queue, 95% of which are wind, solar, battery, or some hybrid of those, looking to interconnect. How do we get them interconnected quickly, reliably, cost effectively? So those are some of our priorities.
Great, thank you. Well, Thad, your company makes up quite a sizable portion of that bridge. So I think you're probably well situated to identify, the priorities you think are needed in terms of market design, possible reforms. And I'd be interested to know if you think, it's different, what you need in PJM may be different from other regions.
Each of the regions are different.
Right.
I think everybody here has laid out a great reason why the complexity and the need for change and the case for change and the importance of markets. But I do want to kind of pause for a minute, Nancy, sure. In the current policy environment we're in, because it's a little concerning at some level, just to put it out there. I mean, states are obviously looking to determine their own resource mix. There's an all-government approach by the current administration to push rules, and we're seeing some unprecedented regulatory actions that are occurring. At the time we're talking about these reliability events, we are seeing changes to major tariffs in the markets where it's about emissions first, cost second, and reliability third. I mean, the Manu just talked about his task force. Let me be clear, PJM market, I mentioned earlier all the statistics, the market's been working. FERC pushed PJM, and PJM complied with actually removing a non-discriminatory tariff. Separately, having nothing to do with PJM itself, but FERC also has removed something called the market seller offer cap, which I won't go into details with, except to say it's price suppressive. So now Manu has launched phase 2 of his effort, which he has to, and we're fully supportive and look forward to engaging. But phase 2 is about how you ensure reliability. The discussion to accommodate this other stuff has already been made, and now we're talking about reliability second. And in my view, and I think in a lot of people's view, that's kind of a cart before the horse problem. We should have been talking about reliability first and how we actually achieve reliability and the emissions target in this new world. Instead, we're accommodating. There is a way to make all this work, but I don't know why we're talking about reliability second, and that, to me, has been a real change. We've got the same thing in New England. Thankfully, in New England, at least the ISO and the stakeholders up there have asked for a 2-year transition period so that before you remove the non-discriminatory aspects fully of the market, there's actually a chance to do the reliability work. And I know that the ISO will be taking that under. So, in a perfect world, you do it the other way around. Now, Manu has the benefit of a big reserve margin that New England doesn't have, so maybe there's time. But I just think we all got to remember reliability has got to be front and center in all of our policy decisions, and to make sure we have time to get this very complicated transition right.
Excellent. So on the policy issue, Devin, I know representing end-use customers as part of your past and the work that you've done for our street. Can you talk a little bit about the role that state policies are having, both within regions and impacting the federal policy, and some of the, it is a very challenging time. That is certainly right on that, and sort of how that is moving forward, and we maybe need to find avenues to move forward in order to address the reliability concerns, which should and is job one.
Absolutely. So first off, we thought states were diverse in the past. Now, I mean, you can't even put together a single report on some of these, like a given region's set of policies. There's so much duplication and overlapping policy overlays on different bits here, and it goes state by state. Some states aren't concerned about climate change. They don't really want anything to do with that might connect them to the federal government more too. Then you have other states that just say, like, we're going to force this transition, or I kind of call it like the kitchen sink climate strategy. We're going to do a cap and trade, an RPS. We're going to pick winners and losers through subsidies in the marketplace, and then everything else on top of that. I think that we need to actually, first off, presume that people's intent, policymakers' intent is well-founded. I think to Thad's point on reliability, I think everyone actually really does care about reliability. I think what we actually have foremost is a reliability and cost education problem. There are folks, a sizable population, that genuinely believe that we can just force all natural gas off the system nationwide this decade and replace it with renewables, and costs will go down and reliability will be maintained. And they honestly believe that. That means that we have a stronger role to play in educating policymakers and understanding these mechanisms. How do markets drive entry and exit? How do they manage risk? What is the technical parameter of this industry, and how do you put that into a market platform that lets, in this case, imperfect substitutes compete with one another on their merits? And if you get that market design correct, guess what? You're going to have your cost minimization and your reliability obligations met. But that requires a great deal of unpacking for a lot of folks, and a lot of the grassroots movement is sort of catching up to speed. But even in the states that a lot of times I think have the perception of not caring about reliability, when they do have a reliability event, talk to the governor's office, right, and we see what happens. So we need to have this conversation, and I think reliability institutions like NERC actually have a stronger role going forward to help provide those metrics and to provide that educational value in reaching out to stakeholders. For example, even down within the industry, PUCs are really struggling with prudency decisions now. They're looking at this and saying, wow, we don't even understand, you talk about RAMP. RAMP is something that's never been classically built into IRP considerations, right? And they're really struggling to kind of operationalize it at that level. Increasingly, reliability, cost, and environmental performance are a function of regional portfolio conditions. And that means that for any entities, individual utilities, or even states acting in a silo, you actually have to have enhanced information flows and better coordination. Ideally, that's through a market mechanism, or at least not undermining markets through sort of symbolically driven policies. And I think we can sort of forge a new consensus that kind of addresses all of these objectives through a market-driven transition, but it's going to take a lot of legwork.
Yeah, that's a great point, because there certainly are policy preferences, but I think from the public's perspective, reliability is sort of just something that they can count on, and they're really, so there's not the attention on how policy decisions impact the operation of the system. So we've covered a lot of issues and brought up some really fundamental both questions and ways forward. So I really just want to open it up and see if there are some responses that anyone on the panel has to another speaker, or the fuel, like how are we dealing with the fuel supply issues, I think is really fascinating and sort of looming right in front of us right now. The risks that you need to assume, whether or not there are specific market mechanisms that we think are sort of maybe fundamental. I think Thad, you could probably get into a couple of those. So the responses to everybody's got, Jim, you look ready to go?
Well, no, I want to make sure I clarify something, because I may have, to this, I got to remember the crowd you're talking to. I may have misspoken or misled, because I was reacting to something that Manu said. My focus on the importance of energy should not be perceived as a plug or anything for energy-only type structures. Capacity is still incredibly important, right? And I think the real issue that I see from a competitive market perspective is how do you make sure that the capacity sticks around that you need, right? And that's where you get into kind of the market design issues and kind of how you structure your capacity markets and what sort of performance obligations do you really put behind them, right? So again, I'm not a market design guy, and I stay away from those questions as best I can. But I didn't want to lead anybody to believe that kind of the importance of energy is to the exclusion of the importance of capacity. It's in addition to.
Right. Well, and your focus was on situational awareness, which I think Devin touched on in terms of some of this is about information, clear metrics, sort of getting the information out both to industry, to system operators, to resource operators, and perhaps the public as much as you can as well.
Well, so situation awareness there are a couple parts to it. One is just kind of knowing what's likely to happen, right? Have a series of scenarios, plan those out. So again, you can think through stuff as opposed to having to solve it all real time. I think one of the other questions that we've got to get our head around, and I really do not know how this works, so this may come across as the most naive statement to this crowd that you've heard today. But one of the questions that I think the markets have to sort out is what's the obligation to perform and what are the penalties for not performing? So when we did our work on Winter Storm Uri and we talked to all the generators that were involved and the analytics and we talked to them about their decision making and so forth, many of them were strictly making, as you would expect, a pure economic decision. And they says, look, it's not worth it for me to invest in this amount of winterization for this unit because I just won't show up that day. And sure, I may forego a day of very high prices, but I don't put enough probability on that happening to justify the investment. Well, that's fine, right? That's how I would expect somebody in a competitive market to work. But that's not the way this industry has always run, right? The industry has always had this obligation to serve, right? Which is kind of now not in the conversation anymore. And so I think the one thing that the market design challenge, or one of the market design challenges we have is to create the proper set of incentives and maybe penalties that, when generators say, I'll be there, they got to be there, right? And if they're not, right, I'm sorry, they should get whacked on the knee. And they should be incented to be there under a broader range of conditions than we might have thought of before. Because the tails in the distribution of outcomes, these tails are becoming really, really important, much more important than they've been in the past. And so that's one of the market design issues that, again, I don't know how to think through because I'm not smart enough. So that's why we have guys like Devin and Travis. But I think that's really one of the brain damage issues that needs to be worked through.
Let me be optimistic for a minute. By the way, Jim, I applaud you. You self-corrected. Normally, my correction is when my team tells me afterwards what I got wrong. So, well done. On a source of optimism, and again, whether it's ERCOT or the Eastern RTO markets, there's market redesign conversations going on in a very real way. Phase 2 in PJM, the effort that New England's kicking off, what is also coincidentally called Phase 2 in ERCOT, around market design. And I'm actually confident, despite the complicated issues, and they're different by regions, right? A lot of zero marginal cost resources already flooding into Texas. The issues we've already talked about with, the MOPR and the MSSC and the Eastern markets, all those are underway. But there's some mechanisms here that I think can make these markets durable. It is true with a lot of zero or negatively costed renewables, capacity markets will become even more important because over time energy margins will degrade. So how do you make them work? I mean, and I'm not going to go through a whole list, but just as a flavor for this, certainly in the Eastern markets, both PJM and New England are both going to look at the effective load carrying capacity or capacity accreditation. By the way, that's not just for wind and solar, that's also for storage, that's also for fossil, right? Where you have units that can't start up within 24 hours. What kind of accreditation is that? That is a huge step forward in making sure the market only pays for capacity that can deliver when you need it to. I agree completely with Jim. Higher penalties, a different structure. If you're going to take the capacity payment, particularly in these eastern markets, and you can't show up, there needs to be, coming back. I think there's a question, even with the ELCCs or accreditation, there's still a lot more variability. Are the previous reserve margin targets the right ones or not? So there's a whole bunch. There's a conversation I was a part of yesterday. A big issue we've had in New England, for example, is that people build plants and the plants don't show up, and so it dampens the compensation to those whose plants do show up. Well, should we go to a prompt year capacity market versus a 3-year forward? All of these are examples in the eastern markets where I think there's real ground to be taken as both of the RTOs proceed through their stakeholder processes here over the next year or two. In ERCOT, it's a little different. I would say right now it's probably in the principal stage because there's a variety of things that could work that have been put up by a variety of parties. What are the principles? Hopefully Devin likes this one, but customers should choose the resource mix, not the legislature or the regulator, right? Markets should be non-discriminatory. Again, we've seen markets where the same asset got paid 5 times as much because it was new and pushed out assets that were, a fraction of the cost were the exact same technology. We can't avoid that. Discrimination shouldn't be in play. Duration of assets have to be taken into account if you're going to be energy-only market without an ELCC to take account of that. And that out-of-market interventions should be minimized. And you certainly shouldn't, when that happens, shouldn't impact price. All of these are things that I think hopefully a lot of people can agree on. And I'm pretty optimistic that the next 2 years, we're going to make a ton of progress on this challenge.
Great, thanks. Manu?
Yeah, sure, Nancy. I'm really optimistic as well, actually. And I'm optimistic because I'll say there's no perfect answer. There's really no perfect answer. There's compromises that we're going to have to come to. And when I joined PJM, one of the line items on my job description was stakeholder process, right? It was just one small line item, and it's sort of all-consuming. And the stakeholder process is hard because you have a lot of really smart stakeholders who have their own economic interests and their own agenda, and they're at the table sort of pushing for that. But I also think the stakeholder process is necessary because I don't think there's a perfect answer. So my encouragement to all of you in the spirit of optimism is please continue participating in our stakeholder process with that spirit of compromise, with the intention to bring your expertise, to push us to what you think is the right answer, but keeping in mind there's no one right answer. There's a compromise that we're going to have to come to that hopefully everyone will get what they need. Not everyone will get all of what they want, to quote the Rolling Stones. The other thing I'll say, just to Jim's point around penalties, I think this issue of penalties is one of the really complex ones that we need to solve. Because if you look at ERCOT, man, there were some generators that got whacked on the knee, to use your news. I mean, they beyond probably what was reasonable or justified or helpful. And so we got to size, you got to have the right economic incentives, both the carrot and the stick, but you have to size it such that the price signal that's being sent has a value. It has an action that can come from it, either in the short term or in the intermediate term. And I think this question of circuit breakers is one that we're thinking about in conjunction with caps. Like what our price cap should be, I think is completely intertwined with how long that price cap should apply for. So I think penalties are critical. I completely agree with Jim's point, but I think that there are some economists that I've heard say, for instance, that what happened in ERCOT is what should have happened with regard to price. And it's not something that I would want to have happen in PJM in terms of either the reliability event, of course, but the pricing action either. And I think that's something for our stakeholders to think about, and they are.
Great, thanks. Devin, I'm going to just open it up for some responses.
Absolutely.
I know
There's
you'll
so
have
many
some.
different directions to go in here. I'll start off with Manu's point on the notion that market design is anything but a clear fix. Even to the top minds in the field, no one's going to agree on all the particulars, but this debate is worth having There's really no alternative. The value of these organized market structures is actually increasing over time. So don't let the frustrations over the debate on the market rules boil over to that point. And I think a lot of times there's some misfires in our public dialogue over that. One area that I think we really need to dig in on within the market design conversation is the issue of correlated outages. And this is a real challenge. You mentioned some of the extreme weather events going forward, and these things are clearly being exacerbated by climate change. That's a matter of fact. The folks with skin in the game are telling us we have a problem. That's not a debate anymore. The question is, how do we actually use forward expectations rather than things like historical data on what's happened over the last 30 to 50 years to be our guide for future conditions on everything like presumed outage rate forecasts, reliability analyses, capacity accreditation, you name it. And so the correlated outage issue, and for everyone, typically the industry has historically worked in this idea of you just have independent, unrelated outages across the system. And as we've seen, especially with more weather-dependent resources, coming online, both natural gas and the renewables categories, that you're seeing a higher correlation of these outages. That naturally raises some unique questions that I don't think we've answered in many regards. What is the role for the reliability standards community in this dialogue versus the role of market design is something we really need to flesh out from sort of like the harmonizing policy instruments. I've always been worried that reliability policy and markets have been operating in silos. We need to be talking to one another and talking about the strength of robust market design as driving a reliable energy transition and a more cost-effective one at that. And so we've got to initiate that dialogue. We've got to have institutional reform that can do this. And we need to overcome some of the political economy challenges of reliability, I think, that exist between some of the federal and regional entities and state entities, and build that dialogue, build that platform, get the literacy up like we talked about, get everyone to kind of buy in on narrowing the range of reasonable debate going forward, and then focusing on how to have the most constructive debate on things like market design as the next few years unfolds.
Great, thanks. Go ahead, Jim.
I want to put something that Devin said. This whole notion of kind of changing your mindset around from random failures, random forced outages, right, which is kind of how we've always kind of planned and thought about the system, to ones where you now have, common mode failures, particularly a big issue with photovoltaic inverter-based resources where they can start acting in tandem, and we've seen that happen too many times at very large scale. That's an issue we got to get our head around. Or a common mode failure, right, where you've got a weather system or some other, or a common condition, I should say, that where a weather system or some other event starts to affect a whole bunch of resource availability in ways that we really haven't thought of before. And I think those are going to become two of the really defining characteristics for what kind of this next iteration of the electric grid looks like. And if we don't get those right, we're going to find ourselves asking some really hard questions like, what should the N-1 condition be? Like right now, it's typically a nuclear unit or something like that, right? But, if we have 10 gigawatts of solar in California that can all act as one single unit, depending on a weather system or a disturbance on the grid that causes them all to trip off, we got to start designing the system to a much higher, right? I mean, now you're talking about real money. Right? So these are the kinds of things that, at least at NERC, we look at and we say, wow, we really got to get in front of these issues because the grid's kind of transforming in front of our eyes, right? We're rebuilding it. We've kind of come out of the grid that we inherited from our grandfathers, and we're building the grid that we're going to leave to our grandchildren. And it's going to be a very, very different structure because of the nature of the resources on it and the environment it probably needs to play in. And as I said, right, this whole notion of a 1 in 10 standard probably worked well when we had a metal bending economy, but we don't anymore, right? So our tolerance for that outage, for that 1 day in 10 is going to be much, much different. We got to get this stuff figured out now so that as we redevelop the system, over the coming 10, 20, 30 years, right, we're leaving something behind that we're going to feel proud of. And right now, it's not completely clear to me that we're going to get there.
Right.
You guys are optimistic. I'm paid to be the half-empty guy.
Well, I can't resist because I am a regulatory policy gal at heart. And this was a question I had for Manu, but I'm just going to pose it to everyone in the last few minutes here. If you could wave a magic wand, what sort of assistance or direction or guidance would you look for out of FERC? Because they play, a critical role in shaping policy, ensuring that there is revenue adequacy to support the investment that's necessary in the infrastructure which is changing over. Jim was just talking about they have authority and oversight over NERC and the development and then the approval of the performance-based reliability standards. They're impacting all of you. Is there something that you would ask of them looking ahead, knowing how challenging things are to address the issues we've got?
Sure, yeah, and I think this ask is for all of us. And I think it's sometimes convenient to ask FERC for something, but actually we put forth normally to FERC our proposals, right? And so this is for all of us. And I think particularly relevant perhaps to this group of folks. I hear regularly from our generator community and others that the pace of change of rules, market rules, is sort of too much, right? It's making it hard for market outcomes to be predictable and is having an effect on financing. And so I think this is an ask for all of us broadly, including FERC, but really starting with us, is let's accept that there's no perfect answer. Let's get to a consensus set of answers, and let's let them run for a period of time unless there's a real issue. I think that rule stability is something we should all strive for.
Great. Would other panelists have different requests?
I think you do see this trend of over the years of incessant tinkering,
right?
with constantly going with these rules. And I look at it versus historically. You mentioned how investors feel about this. You look at it historically, you see a lot of discounting of capacity market revenues because the rules are constantly changing. So a lot of the multi-year outlook for a lot of investment streams, they just sit there and say oh yeah, take this for what it's worth now. We're going to slap a heavy discount on it because we know that the rules are probably going to change in the next couple of years. So you do have this trade-off between the pace of change and the durability of that change. One thing right now is that because we don't have a clear fix on the proper market design that checks all these boxes, and even though, yes, I am sort of a modified energy only proponent, I do recognize that there's going to be, there's a lot of political preference for quantity instruments, either in at least a backstop capacity, but also sometimes as a more formal driver on this front. And I think there's a lot of debate. So I think one thing we need to have is a better set of technical criteria that different types of visions of sustainable market design can be experimented with at the regional level with those stakeholders, right? You have to make sure you're setting a high bar, but FERC doesn't need to be prescriptive on what exact set of market design works best, because actually in many cases I don't think we know. And it's not just an economic question, there's also a political equilibrium question. And so we have to keep that in mind going forward. One of the areas of experimentation right now we haven't talked about is not only just scarcity pricing on sort of the carrot side, but also the performance incentives on the capacity side, the stick, but also a lot of experimentation right now with flexibility products, right? And we don't know actually what the optimal role of product differentiation is in market design. So I think that's an interesting area of innovation that you're seeing a lot of test runs go in different RTOs moving forward. And I think when we set that up, we're going to have an opportunity to collect better information on what works from a cost and reliability perspective, and then we can organically drive that improvement as we revisit those market designs in the coming years.
Great, thank you. So I think we've set the table fairly well for the rest of the day, but any final thoughts from a panelist? That means we've covered everything perfectly. That's what I like to hear. Manu, no? You look.
I was just going to say thank you.
Oh, sure.
I really enjoyed being up on stage with all of you. I thought the conversation, from my perspective, was great, and thank you for having me.
Thank you all for attending.